I want to welcome you to our special lecture tonight. This lecture honors the life and work of Professor Al Harberger, who's here with us tonight, really a kind of pioneer in all aspects of economic development. And the Harberger Lecture has brought to UCLA a number of interesting economists and kind of economic thinkers. So previous lectures have included Jeff Sachs, Joe Stiglitz, and last year, Melinda Gates. So we're really happy to have Esther Duflo from MIT come this year. I'm going to just kind of introduce things and hand things over to Ed Leamer, who will introduce her properly. But we're very pleased to have her come and talk to us about her work on poverty alleviation and development around the world. She's really a pioneer in a number of things, which she'll talk about in a moment. So the way we're going to work is Professor Leamer will introduce Professor Duflo, and then the two of them, after her talk, will sit down in these chairs, have a brief conversation. Ed will moderate the Q&A. We will have time for Q&A, and we do have handheld microphones. So please wait for a microphone if you're called on, and please stand up, and please, most importantly, keep your questions short and to the point. So let me introduce Professor Ed Leamer of the Anderson School, Professor of Economics, Statistics, and Chauncey Medbury Endowed Chair of something or other. Happy to have him.
So it really is a pleasure and an honor for me to have this opportunity to introduce our speaker today, Professor Duflo. I thought it might be useful if I describe where she resides in the intellectual landscape of economics. A very unique position, as a matter of fact. Most economists create knowledge with thought experiments. So let me give you a thought experiment so you see what they're like. This goes back to Adam Smith. It's not quite the same as Adam Smith, but it's very similar. You're supposed to imagine 3 islands. This one island is inhabited by these altruistic, cooperative people. They designed this community, and they're all very happy. Another island is inhabited with these greedy people, and they only want to get ahead of everybody else. And they do have a democracy, but the people they elect have the same problem that everybody else does. They want they want more. And the way you get more is by either stealing from somebody else or commit bribery and corruption. So then the third island is inhabited also by greedy people, but these people have, by some happenstance, created a market system. So they can pursue their greed by creating goods and services that the other people on the island really want to buy. So the market has channeled that greed into a productive way. So you're supposed to be thinking of which island you want to live on. Is it the Bernie Island? Is it the Hillary Island? Or is it the Trump Island? And I don't mean to endorse Donald Trump implicitly. That's a way of saying that thought experiments have serious limitations. So although most of what economists believe, I would say 99%, beginning with invisible hand, it comes from thought experiments. There's a real limit to thought experiments because they don't tell you the magnitudes at all, and often they don't tell you much about directions. So the next step is, what that economists do, the next category are those who study correlations. For example, I heard on NPR that people who do crossword puzzles don't get Alzheimer's. So I said, I got to get this right away. So I jumped in my car and was riding to the closest bookstore, which is a long way in Los Angeles, in order to buy New York Times crossword puzzles. But on the way, I was thinking, it may be that what happens is if you have early onset, undiagnosed Alzheimer's, then you don't do crossword puzzles. So it's only a correlation, not a causation. So I stopped my car immediately, turned around, drove back, trying to figure out whether I should do crossword puzzles or not. And on the way, I tried to think of something in the third category, which is natural experiments. And it occurred to me that as you get farther from New York City, it's probably more costly, a little more difficult to get access to the New York Times crossword puzzles. And I imagine that there also would be a kind of negative slope where Alzheimer's would be relatively rare inside the city where it was easy to do the crossword puzzles and not so bad as you get farther away. So I was going to carry out this exercise of a natural experiment. And already I can see by your expressions, you doubt that that is a real experiment, and you doubt whether a natural experiment is really leading to knowledge. And thus, we're at a kind of impasse in terms of economic knowledge. The next step is laboratory experiments, which have mostly been conducted in classrooms, sometimes set-aside labs, where economists create little games for people to play to try to just figure out how markets operate or how people work under different incentive systems. That's been going on for some time, but it hasn't had a big impact. The next step, which is where our speaker is positioned, is in field experiments, in which she goes around the world doing randomized trials to try to make decisions with regard to the efficacy of one policy or the other. And that's a very rare trait I'm going to talk about with her later on when I'm talking with her directly. Just we'll identify how rare it is, but I wanted you to know how distinctive the intellectual profile of the speaker, how distinctive it is in terms of what other economists do. With that said, my job is to describe this incredible vita, the accomplishments that she's already had at a very young age. She is the Abdul Latif Jameel Professor of Poverty Alleviation and Development Economics in the Department of Economics at MIT and co-founder and co-director of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, known as JPAL. Enormous number of experiments are being conducted under the auspices of JPAL. Her first degrees were in history and economics from the Ecole Normale Supérieure in Paris. She subsequently received a Ph.D. in economics from MIT, and MIT was wise enough to grab hold of her and never let her go, because she's been an MIT professor ever since she graduated, and moving very rapidly through the ranks of MIT. But in addition, in her busy schedule of writing all these papers and advising governments around the globe how they ought to do development planning, she has incredible lists of awards, as if she has time to even receive them all. So her prizes include the Princess of Asturias Award for Social Sciences, the A.SK Social Science Award, Infosys Prize, the David Kershaw Award, the John Banks Clark Medal, which is given to the best economists under the age of 40, a very significant award. She has a MacArthur Genius Grant. She's got everything but the Nobel Prize, and I kind of think that might be in the future too, as a matter of fact. She's got a book that is very well received, a book written by herself and Abhijit Banerjee, the title of which is Poor Economics, A Radical Rethinking of the Way to Fight Global Poverty. That won the Financial Times and Goldman Sachs Business Book of the Year Award in 2011. It's been translated into 7 languages. And 3 times, in 3 years, Foreign Policy has named her to its list of top 100 global thinkers. The Economist lists her as one of the top 8 young economists in the world. She was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential persons in the world in April 2011. Please join me in offering an enthusiastic endorsement or recipe for our speaker.
I'll try to stay on time. So I will sort of skip a little bit on sort of trying to explain what I do, because Ed did that very well, and justify what I do to some extent. And instead, I'm going to present you with a list of questions that doing this work has left us after 15 years, and give you some element of answers. For a while, I was giving some speech that it's important to do randomized control trials, then I got tired of it. And very recently, I went back to talking about randomized control trials in general, as opposed to a particular set of lessons, precisely because I feel we can say something about, with the experience taken together, that we couldn't 15 years ago. So what do? I run randomized control trials. That's not all I do, but that's what most I do. So what do we do in a randomized control trial? We take a study sample where there are various types of people, and then we randomly assign them to different groups. In this example, there is 2 treatment groups and 1 comparison groups. And because we randomly assign them, if the groups are large enough, then we hoping that we have made the groups comparable in most characteristics, such that if one of these groups get a treatment and the other doesn't, and you follow them up till you see some outcomes, you can be pretty sure that the difference in outcome is due to your treatment and not to some inherent differences between the people. So in the crossword example, it would involve taking a group of people, 70 years and older, and starting to give them a crossword to solve every day and tracing their progress over time. Just so that you don't know, it's you get a sense that it's actually something that is reasonable to do in the world. There are actually many ways to introduce randomization in real programs that doesn't seem too obtrusive, so that doesn't look very artificial, so that you can do it anyway. So of course, the most simple way to randomize would simply to take a coin and flip it, or to ask your computer to generate some pseudo-random number and to take the highest one and assign them to the treatment. So that would be that at your simple randomization. You take your sample, randomize program access to eligible participant, and go like that. You can't always do that, because sometimes it's just not possible for a reason or another. For example, if you're working with a bank and you're saying, well, let's randomize who we are giving the loans to, they might not agree, because there are people they really want to lend to, there are people they really don't want to lend to, that they will not let you randomize. So that's not to stop us. We can still introduce randomization. You can do something like that. Suppose, with my bank example, you rank people according to their credit scores. The bank is going to remove some people, reject them all. Some people are never going to be lent to. Some people are going to lend to anyway. They really want to grab those people. But then there is a range of people around the middle that, it's not that this credit scoring model are all that fantastic anyway. So the bank might be willing to introduce some randomization around the middle. It might not even be 50-50 below and above, but there is some, they might be willing to treat, say, to not lend to 15% of the group that would otherwise qualify, and to lend to 60% of the group that would otherwise not qualify. And this way you create randomization there. So that's one way in which you can introduce randomization in a program where people would not otherwise be willing to do it. Another pretty common way, and this is the way most randomization was introduced initially, is by going progressively over time. So you have a government or an NGO or a firm, anybody who is rolling out a product or a program or a policy, doesn't matter what it is. And then you're saying, well, in the first year, we're randomly dividing the groups into three. In the first year, we're going to treat group A. In the second years, we're going to introduce group B. In the third year, we're going to introduce everybody. So in year one, group B and C are comparison group for group A. In year two, group C is comparison group for B and C. And in year three, you don't have a comparison anymore. That's not a great design, because if group C could anticipating being treated after 3 years, group B is anticipating getting treated after 2 years, and you don't necessarily understand what these anticipation effects do. So people have moved away a little bit from this phasing design when possible, but that remains an option. Another very useful tool that we have is what we call encouragement design, which is very useful. So when you want to evaluate a nationwide policy. So for example, you want to evaluate a pension program that's available to all the poor people above the age of 65. So you can't randomize it because it's a policy, so it's not possible. But you notice that a lot of people don't take it up because they don't know it exists, or because there is too many hoops to jump, it's too complicated, etc. Then you can create an encouragement design by saying, well, let me take the people who are currently not getting the pension, divide them into two groups. In one group, I'm going to go send young, enthusiastic volunteers, help them fill out the form, giving them the information and the like. And this way, I know that they have they will be more likely to get the pension. Maybe not for sure, but let's say 45% of them do manage to get the pension. And then in the second group, you don't do anything. Some of them manage to find their way into the pension office anyway. So 20% of them get the pension, let's say. So it generates a difference of 25 percentage points that is purely due to your randomization. And there are some assumptions you can use that to recover the effect of the pension. So all that was not to give you a crash course in experimental design in 2 minutes, but just to give you a sense that there is a range of tools that can be used to introduce randomization in the real world, and therefore it has been possible to do on a much broader set of issues and on a much broader set of policies and topics that you could otherwise have imagined. So why randomize? Well, we randomize because randomization allows us to create a credible counterfactual and identify the causal effect of a specific policies. That means the way I think about it is, for me, it's almost impossible to try to think about the cause of effect. I can only think of the effect of cause. I think physicists are interested in dividing the whole model of the world, so they want to know what caused what. I can't do that. I can only think about the effect of cause, which means think about an intervention that can be turned off or turned on. It could be an intervention or a trait or something like that, and you follow on what are the effects of these things. So with randomization, you can do that because by definition, you vary, you toggle on and off in a way that you control, and therefore you can credibly answer that particular question. Which can be a question which is of economic interest, which can be a question which is of policy interest, which hopefully is not a question that has no interest to anyone. So often people say, well, that's nice, but it sort of limits you to reasonably narrow questions. Very well-defined narrow questions. Why do we really care? Why don't we just go with thought experiments? We have economic theory to guide us on what's the important factors. And maybe those factors say the rule of law or democracy or microeconomic stabilities are not things that you can manipulate in an experiment anyway. So basically, when you run experiments, that's nice and well. You can estimate your causal effect very well, but you're precisely estimating uninteresting stuff. So you're just looking under the lamppost. It turns out that you can open it's a little bit better than looking under the lamppost that you happen to have, but it's moving about with the lamppost, as opposed to kind of lighting up the whole room. The other thing that people are arguing, especially now, where there is this whole crawling the design space and blah, 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 is the idea that maybe we are stifling innovation by requesting, by putting a standard of proof that's too high before moving forward. So my answer here is I would say details are incredibly important. And the reason why we want to look, so it's not to say that all of you should immediately jump and stop to do everything you are doing and run randomized controlled trials. So I don't want to say that it's the only thing one could do. I just want to say why I think it is something worth doing and therefore worth my time. And the reason why it is worth at least one person's time, and that could be me, is that there are many, even beyond accept these big ideas, there are many, many details to be figuring out. And these details are incredibly important, and intuition provides us no guidance of what these details will do. No guidance. 0 on magnitude, as Ed said, and usually also the direction might also be wrong. So I'll give you one example. So for example, on education. So education is important. Yes, sure. But you're a government, what does it mean? Education is not a thing. Education is a bunch of teachers. It's a bunch of people to put into classrooms. Do you need big classrooms with very educated, well-paid teacher, or small classroom with less paid teacher? If you know the intuition for that, that's great, but I don't know. So I just want to give you one example that doesn't rest on an RCT to give you one example on that, which is, let's say we assume that democracy might be important we agree on that. But democracy is a bunch of rules, is a set of rules. And those rules are incredibly important in the functioning of democracy. Otherwise, people would not fight about ID laws. And I'll give you one example to just how important they are. It's a paper by Toma Fujiwara, who is an assistant professor in Princeton. And it looks at Brazil. And it looks at this is a system that they had in Brazil to elect their people. It's a bit complicated because first it's in two parts. Most of you are too young to remember butterfly ballots, but they're not a good idea. Second of all, on the second part, there is actually nothing written because you have to refer to some big book that's on the side and then write down the number of the person you want to vote for that second election. And if you get it wrong, your vote is invalid. So of course, many votes happen to be invalid because people got it wrong. And then they changed the system and they replaced it with this new system, which is where you're punching the number. When you're punching the number, the face of the fellow you want to vote for appear. You can change your mind, saying he really doesn't look so appealing, or you can say that's really the guy I was looking for, and then you actually punch the button. So what Toma Fujiwara did is he studied the introduction of that thing. And what allows him to study the introduction of that thing is that it was introduced in two phases. In 1998 for the big cities, above 40,000 people, and in 2002 for all the cities. And what it shows is that when you go from the green line to the blue line, you can see that the blue line has a big jump at 40,000. So basically the number of DCs on the left is the number of valid votes. So the fraction of valid votes, actually. Fraction of valid votes over the turnout. The fraction of valid votes increased by about 12 percentage points when the system was introduced. And then the red city, small city, got brought in, and their fraction of valid vote increased. So this machine, which was not introduced for this reason, it was introduced to facilitate counting, has the impact of re-enfranchising 12% of people who couldn't get the number right. And that's incredibly important because who cannot get the number right? The people who cannot read very well. And therefore, the people who, the people who got newly enfranchised by the system are the poor people. Who did they elect? Poorer people, more left-wing people. And what did these people do? Well, they did more left-wing policy and more pro-poor policy. So this little machine inside, which was introduced for some other reason, had an impact on the shift of electoral policy in Brazil in a way that no one went then again back and saying, well, we better revert that because all these poor people are going to take the wrong decisions. So that's it for trying to convince you that looking at details is important. In a sense, that train has sort of left the station. As Ed pointed out, over the last 15 years, JPAL, which is a network of researchers that I helped create, is now quite active. We have 700 randomized controlled trials in 64 countries in a bunch of sectors: agriculture, education, political economy, governance, etc. Why do I put this map? Not to show you the impressive achievement that we had, but to tell you that because there are so many experiments and some of them have been going on for a while, we can start answering questions that really we didn't know. We sort of took a little bit on faith when we got started. And these are the key questions that I want to briefly go over that we are kind of able to talk a little bit about after 15 years. One is a question that probably you already all have in your mind, is whether results generalize from context to context. So of course, very important because if you can very well estimate the causal effect in one village, but the next village is entirely different, well, first you have a big problem in your hands, which is it's not clear how you could do policy in such a world. But second of all, it's not clear that it was so useful to do the RCT in the first village anyway, because you generate no knowledge that can be used later. The second question is whether successful programs can be mainstreamed into government without too much loss in transmission. That's a very important question, not necessarily for economists who could be interested in just doing RCTs to produce pieces of knowledge about how people behave, but for anybody who is interested in influencing policy or having something to say to policy. The third is whether there is any appetite by policymakers to actually use that evidence. And the fourth is whether there is any appetite by policymakers to produce that evidence. So in other words, the talk today is going to be less about economics, as I practice it, but about the interface between economics and policy. Which in a sense is not what I'm so much specializing within JPAL, because the reason why JPAL existed was to take care of that for all the researchers, but that I've become interested in by being closely involved in a lot of those discussions. So do results generalize from context to context? So unfortunately, the only way to know that is to try it out. So there are now a few examples of, so the advantage of having lots and lots and lots of experiments is that there are now enough examples that we can actually put them together and try to answer these questions. So I'm going to give you two very briefly. One, and give you the results from them. One slightly more formally than the other. So the first one is a typical policy evaluation in the sense that it's a program that does lots of stuff together. So it's a program that was started by BRAC, Bangladeshi MFI, which is doing a lot of microcredit, and they realized that a bunch of people in the villages were not even interested. The poorest people in the villages were not interested in microcredit. And they said, what can we do for them? And decided to do like a big push approach. So imagine Paul Rosenside-Roden big push approach at the local level, which is trying to do everything for a year. It's costing a lot of money, but the idea is that it's going to pull people off poverty, and then you never have to go back to these people again. They will integrate the market. So the idea is something stopping them to join the bandwagon of economic activities. So when they have a beneficiary, they give them an asset transfer, savings, home visit, technical skill training, consumption support, and a health program. All of that they do together. It's not cheap. And the question is, does it work? They did a big randomized control trial in Bangladesh. As they were scaling the program, Oriana Bandira and Robin Burgess looked at it, and they found pretty large effect. The question is, does it generalize? That's actually, I shouldn't have started with that program. Let me start by this one. Which is, so what we did with Dean Carl and Abhijit Banerjee and a long bunch of other people is we worked with BRAC to help them replicate the project with a bunch of other countries. So each of these countries, the program is slightly different because it's adapted to the local level, but it's really the philosophy of BRAC, and it's ensured by the fact that BRAC is there to train people and talk to them. But it's implemented sometime by government, sometime by hundreds of NGOs, sometime by a very good NGO, etc. And what do we find? Well, you find that for the assets result, basically, in all countries besides Honduras, you have an increase in assets. The results vary from country to country, but they are positive everywhere in line 1, which is right after the end of the program, and line 2, which is 18 months later. This is for consumption, and you reproduce the same results again, which is everywhere except in Honduras. You have positive results. And this is now, so we have to be very patient to publish in Science. So we run these 7 studies together and send them to one paper. So per word in a page, that was probably my most expensive project. And this is the results pooling across sites. So this gives you just the average effect across sites for a bunch of outcomes. And what it shows is when we take all of these sites together, which are very, very diverse, very, very different, across all of the outcomes, except women's decision-making, we tend to find positive and significant results. So I'm aggregating both across countries and across outcomes. So at the end of the day, I'm pretty sure the program does work. I haven't selected a variable. These are all the variables available. I haven't selected a country. These are all the countries taken together. One can do a little bit further, and in fact, this is in process for this country, but I'll show it to you for microcredit, than just saying, well, look at it, I have 7 studies, don't they look reasonably similar except Honduras? You can do that much more formally. And ask yourself the question, how would the policymaker use the information for several RCTs? What they would do is take whatever they think, their own prior on what the results might be, and combine it with the different studies, thinking that, well, when I see studies that have different effects, it could be because the effects are truly different, or it could be because they come from a different distribution. So it could be because they are truly different, or it could be because the sample happened to be different. So we want to try and distinguish these two. So this can be done with Bayesian hierarchical modeling of sort of to combine different studies. So a student of mine, Rachel Meager, did that for Microcredit. And why could she do that with Microcredit? Because we had a bunch of studies coming out. So Microcredit in the 2000 was all the rage. By the end of 2015, there was a big rage against Microcredit. And in all that, there was very little evidence going on. So what happened there? Well, what happened there is that several teams, this was not a coordinated effort, several teams had run experiments on different microcredits. And so we can combine them. This is the effect on profit. The blue line is just this standard mean estimate. The red one are the one that are trying to figure out how are the true effects varying by using this Bayesian hierarchical modeling. And you can see that, well, it doesn't really seem to work very much. There is all of the effects, none of the effects can reject 0, and they all want to pool. They really all want to tell you we are really 0. So the niceness of the nice thing of this analysis is that it tells you the extent to which the data points are trying to be the same. So we don't need to do it informally. They all want to be 0 for profit. They all want to be 0 for consumption. So Microcredit doesn't do all that much. And the result from this study, and to some extent from the ultra poor study as well, does suggest that in those two examples there is a fair amount of pooling. All of the studies are trying to tell us the same thing, either positive or negative. The second question is whether successful program can be mainstream into government without too much loss in transmission. If you're worried about the timing, this is going the last 2 points are going to go much faster. So there are a number of issues with that. The first one is that when you move from a small experiment to a larger one, you could start hitting equilibrium effect. That suddenly, if you give one cow to a person, that's fine, but if you give it to the entire village, there's going to be too many cows in the village. The second problem is that as programs are scaled up, you're moving down the potential marginal benefits because maybe the people who need it the most get it first, and then as you move down, the effects go down. The third problem is that governments, even if these problems were not there, governments might not be able to implement a policy as well as an NGO would be, so you just would not get the same program in reality. Of course, some stuff are not scaled by government, they are still by private agents, but here I'm focusing on governments. So the only way to find out is to try out. And until recently, it was really not too much, people were not doing too much of that because those experiments are very large. If you want to capture equilibrium effect, you have to go at scale. If you want to know all of the issues that you have when you go to scale, you have to go at scale. So they are large, and they tend to fail precisely because you're hitting all of these issues that you're supposed to hit at scale. But now this is really changing, and you have a number of these issues. So here's just one example from Europe that I was involved with, looking at active labor market policies, which illustrates nicely the equilibrium problem. So active labor market policies is pretty much the only anti-unemployment policies that European countries have, which is when people are unemployed, they try to set them up with people to help them wear a tie, polish their interviews, giving some phone calls, finding them a job. So people have evaluated those policies by running randomized control trial, doing something like here, for example. So randomizing a quarter of the people into getting the program and then comparing them to people who didn't get the program. And generally, those policies show modest effects, but real effects. Nice? The problem is that when you do that, you don't know whether the blue person is being helped because there is one more job created in the economy, because all of these people who cannot tie their ties actually have all sorts of skills that now the job market is going to discover. Or the blue people is getting the job that the white people would have gotten if we had not helped him. And the only way to know that is to do an experiment of this form, which is randomized first at the labor market level, which in France is a town, because French people don't like to move too much. And then within that, randomize what fraction of people you're treating for the program. So we treated 0, 25% of eligible, 50% of eligible, 75% of everybody. And now we are going to compare this person to this person, and then this person to that person who has no competition. And here's what you find. So this is the basic evaluation. And you find that there's no effect for women. And men who are treated are 5 percentage points more likely to be employed after 6 months than men who are not treated. Very nice. However, I'm now added back the control people, and I'm now comparing the white people here with the control people. And you find that this positive effect is almost entirely compensated by a negative effect on people who didn't get the program. So basically, it's mostly a game of musical chair, and there is very little net effect. So there are many more such examples in recent years. Kartik Muralidharan is working on that. We are working on a report card for schools, etc. We are working also on scaling up within governments, trying and failing until things stick, which is also informative, but I'm not going to spend too much time on now. Another question is whether anybody cares. Suppose that you manage to do that, you show something, you show that it would be worthwhile scaling it up. Is anybody listening? Well, it seems to be this is we are trying to track down the number of lives that are affected by programs that someone in JPAL has found to be effective. And as of the moment that I took this graph, it was about 202 million people. But now there is nationwide deworming program, nationwide deworming day in India. So which is a direct result of research that has been conducted by JPAL people, Michael Kramer and Ted Miguel. So every year there is some more millions. But you can see that it's actually quite a few people which have been directly affected by policies we've evaluated. And this happens in two ways. This happens either because the government scales up. The government, you try something within the government, it works within the government and they scale it up. So for example, Abhijit and Banerjee and Arnold can have a program of distributing identity card, beneficiary card for beneficiary of the subsidized rice program in Indonesia. So the identity card just tells people that you're eligible to that much rice. They have a complicated design with lots of different treatment, etc. But the bottom line is what matters is people who got the card got 7,000, basically a doubling, more than doubling of the subsidies that they were entitled to. The government was happy, they just scaled it up, 65 million people get touched. The other way in which that happens, and then that might be more for some of the younger people in the room, is someone figures something out. This is Pascaline Dupert, who used to teach here. In fact, this is a job market paper. And then someone takes the idea, some entrepreneur, basically social entrepreneur takes the idea, this is Noam Angrist, takes the idea and run with it and start an organization to scale this up. The last question is whether, in a sense, this is all well and fine, but this is always going to rely on a relatively limited number of academics who have time to run these experiments, and they're becoming larger and larger, and we need more and more government support. So ideally, we could sort of step away from this business and let things happen in the same way that it's happening now with firms. And what do we see that? We seem to see that there seems to be interest by policymakers to experiment on their own policies. I'll give you just one example and I'll stop. We worked with the environmental, I'll show you a photo. We worked with this guy, the Gujarat Pollution Control Board. That's Gujarat on a good day. It's a very fastly growing industrial state. But it has a bit of a problem, which is it's one of the most polluted people on Earth. It's not because they're not trying. They have very strong threshold for environmental pollution, but they have a problem that the firms are not really doing it. So they have an audit system. The audit system is that each firm has to hire an auditor that has to come to visit them 3 times a year to check their pollution level. The problem is that the firm have to hire the auditor, so there is a huge conflict of interest, which is the auditor's interest is to give the firm the data that they need, which is basically showing them a clean bill of health. So what we did is that we collected some data from these audits and compare them to going back 2 weeks later to the same firm. So this is what you get from the audit. You can see that 73% of firms are just below threshold, very nice. But this is what you get from the back check of the same firms. This is basically, the data is all made up. So what we did with them is that which is a little bit audacious when you think of it, is we randomized regulation. We said some firms, you're still under that system. Some firms, we are going to introduce this new audit system where you cannot hire the auditor directly anymore. You pay into a pool. The auditors will be randomly assigned from that pool to you, and then the auditors will be paid by the pool. And when we do that, this is what we found in the treatment group, which was much better. This is control group. This is treatment group. You see that it looks much better. At the end of the day, what did this lead to? A reduction of pollution among the worst polluting of the firms. And after having done that, the government was pretty interested. They had done the experiment themselves. They could do better what they wanted to do anyway. So it led to a change in policy in Gujarat. So now they have that system where. So I'm going to stop here because I'm already out of my time. And I think I gave you a sense of where are those the questions that occupy me and some elements of answer.
I'd like to explore your early career. We have many students in this auditorium, and they're just beginning on their career. I don't think you had, when you first started MIT, any idea you'd be where you are now. So how did you get in this enterprise at MIT?
So I came to MIT to study development. Actually, I think I came to MIT to study economic transition. Then I realized economic transition was really development. So very quickly I got interested in development because I came to MIT in order to, when I discovered, I spent a little bit of time in Russia. I spent a year in Russia before really wanting to become an economist. And what I was really impressed by in Russia is the fact that economists had a fantastic position of having the luxury of taking all the time they wanted to come with answers that were credible, but then having someone who was actually willing to listen to them. And I thought this was ideal compared to being a politician or an NGO where you have to move no matter what, or compared to be, say, a historian where people might not care as much what you have to say, at least in the policy world. So that's why I came to MIT, to affect policy, but I didn't know how. And I very quickly realized that my tribe was in between labor economics and development economics. And at the time, I was taking Josh Angry's class, and he taught me to think of experiments as the benchmark to aspire to. And so all my dissertation was about natural experiments. I looked at various natural experiments here, there, and there, and I wrote all my introduction about the ideal experiment would be to randomly assign schools, but since we cannot do that, this is what and eventually I was like, whatever. Michael Kramer was starting to actually do experiment, and I said, I'm just going to stop writing about the ideal experiment. I'm going to join this bandwagon and try and do the experiment. So as soon as I got a paycheck and some research money, that's what I started to do.
So there was infrastructure in place at MIT to conduct these experiments?
No. The beginning had no, we were doing that with no infrastructure. We were doing that like it was the Wild West. You could, the first project that I did was in collaboration with Pratham, who is a wonderful education NGO in India. And they came, I don't think they had any idea what they were getting into, and we didn't have an idea either, and we kind of learned together there. Meanwhile, Michael was learning in Busia. So, yeah, there was a little bit of money floating by, and infrastructure got created as we moved along The other project that I did, second project that I did at the same time, was looking at the impact of female versus male policymakers. And there I used a natural randomized experiment. In India, reservations for women, quota for women are randomly assigned to villages. So you could, that was given to me, so it wasn't that expensive. Once I had done these two, I had enough to go on to raise more money and little by little grow the infrastructure.
So was this all well received by the profession? Did you get immediate acclaim like you're having now, or was there a period in which you wondered whether this was a good choice that you were making? Because it's very distinctive, unlike what most of the other economists are doing.
No, I can't complain. It's been a good ride. I think when I started doing development, I think there was a great tradition in development of going to the field, with questions in mind that were inspired by theory. So this tradition was there. But for a while, I think for the right reasons, the field had turned more theoretical. And so we had a new body of theory that we could play with. And it was time to arbitrage by bringing some new method that in the meantime had been developed in public finance, labor, econometrics, etc. So that's what I was doing during my dissertation, because I had these two advisors that were straddling the field. And so that was kind of, people seemed to like it. And then from then on, I kept, at the beginning, I kept doing more traditional things to make sure that I was earning a paycheck, and then it was enough to.
So you've told us about some of your most successful projects. What about unsuccessful ones? Do you have any advice for students that when things don't turn out so well and they persevere, anything like that you'd like to say?
So my first research project, very first data collection effort was you don't know about for a good reason. So we had this great idea. It was not for a randomized control trial. I was still in graduate school. We had this great idea that we were going to look at very small tailors in India. Their houses keeps getting destroyed. It's one neighborhood in Kolkata where they live next to ponds and rivers. So their house keeps getting flooded. So every time the house gets flooded, they have a big shock, and they also get sick. They have all sorts of shocks. And our idea was that we would look at whether, when they have a shock, they produce more or they produce less. And the idea is, if they are not credit constrained, they should produce more because they need the money. But if they are credit constrained, they're going to produce less because they need the money to fix their house. So that was a good idea, maybe. I don't know. The reason why I don't know is that, so I had never collected any data in my life. We hired these people that Abhijit knew from elsewhere, etc. They were working on that, but I didn't really know how to monitor them, etc. So that went on for a while, and then after a while, I realized that they were just literally making up the data. And so then, after 3 years, because it was a panel, by the time I arrived to the third wave, I realized they were making up the data. So what I decided then is, I better train. And I went and knocked on the door of a professor in Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta, who had done a lot of field work, and I told him about my idea for the woman as policymaker, and I asked him to work with me, and he told me what he knew. And so I guess my advice, but that would be easier now, is don't jump into your first project with your own 10 fingers. You'll make mistakes, probably irreparable mistakes. But join a team, work with people. There are a few things to learn about how to collect data that seems obvious ex post, but are better to try.
So here at UCLA, we have what's known as the Office of the Human Research Protection Program, which requires rather elaborate filing of what's going to go on and make sure that the human subjects are protected. Do you face that kind of issue with regard to either MIT overseeing what you're doing and or the governments, the host governments where you're doing these experiments? Or is there
So MIT, yes, naturally. So every research with human subject in the US that's run from an academic institution needs to be overseen by an institutional review board. So MIT has one. It's a pretty good board. They are very good. They are easy to work with. In the governments, it depends. Sometimes governments have sometimes there are boards in countries, sometimes they are not. What we try to do when they don't have boards in countries is to create them so that there is some in-country oversight of what is being done, both because it's the right thing to do and because it avoids dangers of, if we run into political problem, media problem, or something like that, what are these foreigners doing research without any oversight? So we always try to create such a board to oversee.
And you've had difficulties in getting these things approved, or is it pretty easy?
No, it's pretty easy.
I see.
I mean, there are clear guidelines about what you can do and what you cannot do and how to do things, and they are basically internationally approved principles, which seems very reasonable to me. So I have not found them they are constraining, but for the right reason. For example, one of the constraints is you have to inform people of what you're doing, unless you cannot do your research if you don't inform them. So typically, people need to be informed. People should not be lied to. All of this is pretty sensible. And then there are some requirements on confidentiality, data security, and all that. You would want them if you are a subject. So it does constrain. There are stuff we cannot research, and such is life.
So let's talk about this other paradigm, which is studying correlations, and that's afflicted by the confounders. So you look at the correlation between y and x, and you need to control for z, and you get a different partial correlation. You add a q, and you get a different partial correlation. So these confounders are going to cause havoc in drawing inferences from correlations, sets of correlations. But the confounders are influencing you as well. You use the word randomized controlled trial. That word control is often in an experimental setting in which you have a randomized treatment. It's also often a reference to the fact that you set up experimental controls to minimize the impact of the confounders. But as far as I can tell, you just take the confounders as they are and use only randomization. So then the question is, how do you get away from the problem of, well, you kind of address this, what I would call interactive confounders, where the effect of the treatment is going to vary from setting to setting, but also the potential for having large numbers of confounders that would cause ambiguity or uncertainty in the treatments that you're giving, in the estimated treatments.
So there are two different issues. One is the question of external validity, which is the idea that these, what you call confounders, but these X variables, you know that they are balanced between treatment and control because you have randomized, but they might still affect the effect of the treatment, which will limit your ability to infer anything from another site. So one way, I think the only way to really know about that is to conduct more experiments and to try to learn from these experiments as we accumulate them. So I think that's not an answer that we are going to have soon, and it's not an answer that is going to be one size fits all. In some cases, like in the microcredit, we're going to find very strong pooling. In some cases, we're going to find that it varies on the covariates. At a conceptual level, it's a very interesting question, because once you start getting interested, suppose you are interested in the effect of how the treatment effect vary in different subgroups. The problem is that you're back in the world of observational studies, because how do you define the subgroups? There are potentially very many. You could say, suppose you don't find an effect for the whole population, you say, well, but people who have green hair and their jacket just so, that they have an effect. And of course, like if you run 100 regression, 5 of them will give you the result you're looking for. So you have to have a way to discipline that. And at the same way, you don't want to straitjacket you. So I think there's a lot of very interesting work to be done on exactly this issue of how do we even think about knowing how much variability there are across X's. Now, the other question you asked is about what if something perturbs your treatment effect itself? So that could be, for example, that the program was never implemented. So this program was never implemented. It doesn't have an effect, but it's not because the intervention itself, should it be implemented, has no effect. It's because it was not implemented. And there, sometimes you want to neutralize that, and sometimes you don't. It really depends. What I keep saying is that randomization does not free you from the necessity to think. It helps you thinking. It provides you additional fodder. But if you don't think, it's not going to be interesting anyway. So it's not a substitute, but it's a pretty good complement. So in here, you're thinking, well, you really have to define the question narrowly. So sometimes the question might be, what is the effect of providing an iron pill to an adolescent girl on their anemia? I don't think it's a question economists would be very interested in, because but some people definitely are interested in this question. Then you really want to be behind this person and giving them the anemia pill. By the way, economists could be interested, what's the effect of this iron pill on cognitive scores or earnings? If that's your question, you need to make sure that she gets the pill, which is possible. You just have to need enough resources to be behind everybody making sure they take the pill. That's a fine and interesting question. Now, suppose someone has shown that there is huge effect. In fact, someone has shown that there is huge effect of giving people iron pill on cognitive scores. So you're a government and you're interested in, oh, should I set up a program where we're doing that? There, you're not going to be behind every person giving them your pill. So the only thing you can do, there are various things you could try. Let's say you can try distributing through schools. There you could randomize the program at the school level where schools get the pills, or you could sell them, you could give them to local shops and ask the shops to sell them, whatever your idea of implementation is. And then you're going to follow up, maybe you're going to follow up anemia, and then you could say, well, that's as an indication for taking the pill, it's very contaminated. But the truth is that what you're interested here is really the effect of trying, what we call intention to treat, is the effect of giving the pill to the schools, and then who knows what happens. Ideally, you've collected a lot of data to understand the whole chain. So it sort of depends. So my view is that when we are interested in the effect of an intervention itself, we should try to make sure that it happens. And then you work on smaller scale with very good implementation level and try to make it controlled so you get closer to a lab, but in field conditions, obviously. Or sometimes we're interested in all the messiness of the world and implementation because that's what we want to study, and then you move the other scale.
So I endorse completely the idea that no matter how you're creating knowledge, wisdom is a critical input, whether it's a thought experiment or a
I don't think it's very
correlation.
controversial, but sometimes people forget that I might think
by
that.
revealed preference, it's quite controversial, as a matter of fact. But I want to ask a question about that, because you're attracting more people into this enterprise that you're conducting. And the question is do we have the right allocation of our intellectual activities across thought experiments, studying correlations, trying to identify natural experiments versus randomized trial? Do we want more randomized trial? Are we doing about this right amount? Or what's your view on that?
No idea.
No idea, okay. Let me ask you another question.
Exactly, like no one has that
I
explained.
have one more question, which is the city of Los Angeles has a first world geography that's close to the ocean, but as you get farther and farther away from the ocean, it turns into a kind of third world. So all these things that you're studying in developing countries seem to me to be relevant to much of the city of Los Angeles. Do you have any advice for what the mayor can do to make the city healthier and improve, reduce poverty and improve employment rates for all these folks in the interior?
So Leo Borstein and Rob Jensen, both from UCLA, did very interesting work in LA schools, LA high schools. Looking very much inspired by, or maybe they would have gotten to it anyway, but Rob is, and Leo to some extent, trained as development economist and very much inspired by method of development economists, trying to understand, set up experiments to understand peer effects among students, whether people get discouraged to show that they are trying hard in front of their peer or stuff like that. So there is JPAL North America, more generally. JPAL North America started a few years ago and sort of tricked back some of this idea of, I mean, it's not that there always been experiment in the US. In fact, Rand health insurance experiment out of Santa Monica is one of kind of the oldest one. But the experiments that were done in the US were more sort of policy experiment run by very, very good shops like MDRC, for example, rather than people did as academics. And now it came back. So I think we can treat the problem. The problems are slightly different, but the approach to them can be reasonably similar.
So what does that mean in terms of what the mayor ought to do? You get better peers for people? Or what is it that you have in mind in terms of actual policy when you talk about peer effects?
So let me think. I should not get the study wrong. So I have the example in mind, which is the true policy example that motivated their experiment. So I'll give you this one, which was in remedial classes, which were done on computers. They decided to have a leadership board where the best people, the best scores would be displayed on a leadership board on the class. And the moment that this was not an RCT, this was at some point it was introduced, and the moment it was introduced, the scores plummeted in the classrooms. So here the policy would be don't put the leadership board. Then their experiment was much more subtle than that. They had a first experiment and then a second one, which gives you a bit of a sense of when peers are reinforcing effort, when peers are not reinforcing effort, gives you reasonably clear projection on when you should get kids to decide together, when you should, which I think would, when you should make sure that kids take decision independently. So you cannot easily change the peer. I mean, you can to some extent, but what's the new curate? You can curate the way that their interactions are going on, and what their research suggests is that makes an enormous difference.
So if there was something like peer effects or cultural effects that take a long time to grade, they're going to be hard to pick up in a randomized trial, are they not?
Anything that takes a long time to pick up just needs a long time.
Okay, we just need to give you more money and more
time. I have an experiment that I'm working on with Pascaline Dupin and Michael Kramer, where we gave people scholarships to go to secondary school. We gave them the scholarship in 2007. We already followed them several times, but we are intending to follow them forever. Until they die or we die, whichever comes first. I think we'll die first.